Would you trust a 1-year-old German Shepherd puppy with someone's life? When I slammed on the brakes outside Bozeman, Montana, this young shepherd stood in the middle of a blinding daytime blizzard, ice crusted in his fur, refusing to move until I followed him up the mountain. 1 second, I was alone on that 2-lane mountain stretch, and the next, there he was, planted dead center between the yellow lines. He didn't flinch when my truck skidded and the ABS rattled under my foot. He just stood there like he'd decided the whole highway could wait. Not a wild dog. He had a worn collar around his neck, packed with ice, and his ears were tipped back from the wind, but his eyes were sharp and locked on mine like he'd been waiting on this exact truck. I rolled to a stop so close I could see his breath hit the glass. Big paws pressed against my door as he rose up, nose smearing a wet streak across the window. He wasn't barking or spinning the way a lost dog usually does. He just stared at me, chest heaving, snow stuck in his whiskers, like he was checking if I understood him. So I've seen plenty of dogs on back roads, but this one didn't feel like an accident. The way he kept glancing past me toward the ridge above the road told me he was out here on purpose. Not for himself. For someone. I cracked the door and the wind punched into the cab, throwing snow in my face. He dropped back to the ground, tail low but steady, trotted a few yards ahead, and turned sideways, watching me over his shoulder. If a dog can ask a question without making a sound, that's what he did right then, waiting in that spinning wall of white to see if I'd leave the engine running or step out and follow. He didn't wait for an invitation. The moment I sat back in the truck, that German Shepherd spun around and trotted up the road, head down into the wind, like he just hired me for a job I never agreed to. I eased the truck into gear and crawled after him. The whiteout swallowed everything 10 feet from the bumper, but I could see his shape sliding in and out of the snow, checking over his shoulder every few seconds to make sure I was still there. He never bolted. He never tried to disappear. He just held that same steady distance, like he knew exactly how fast an old pickup could climb a mountain in a storm. We hit a straight stretch, and I pulled closer. That's when I saw the tag hanging off his collar, iced over and clinking against the buckle. At the next rolling stop, I reached out through the window, caught it with my fingers, and wiped the snow away. Arthur Hayes. A scratched-in address up in the foothills. 1 phone number, and under it, stamped in letters that made my chest tighten, "If I'm out here alone, something's wrong." Right then, my dashboard lit up with another warning about the bomb cyclone and road closures. Signal dropped to 1 bar, then none. Every sensible part of me said to turn around, get off that mountain, let someone else handle it. But the only someone I had in front of me was a dog cutting a path through the storm. A mile later, the road narrowed to a single lane, carved through the drifts. He moved to the center again, blocking my way, then sat down in the snow and stared over the hood until I flipped on my turn signal and followed him up the unmarked side road he'd been guarding all along. The higher we climbed, the less that road felt like a road and the more it felt like a mistake. The plow tracks faded into slush, then into nothing. That German Shepherd puppy trotted inside my headlights, ears iced over, glancing back every few steps like he was checking I hadn't bailed on him. I dropped into low gear and let the truck crawl. He ran ahead, then looped back to bump the side of my door with his shoulder when I was a roadburn. When I tapped the brakes, he jumped up, grabbed my sleeve, and tugged. One hard pull that said stopping wasn't part of the plan. Another bend and the rear end started to slide. Forward turned into sideways, and sideways into stuck. I sat there, listening to the wind hammer snow against the glass. The dog stood by the headlight, chest heaving, eyes locked on me. I've worked enough mountain calls to know when the truck has done all it can. This was boot work. I killed the engine and grabbed my pack, a headlamp, and an emergency blanket. When I opened the door, the cold slapped the air out of my lungs. He moved in close, shoulder pressed to my leg while I clipped an old lead to his collar. The moment the snap clicked, he leaned into it and pulled, dragging us onto what used to be a driveway. I didn't know who he was taking me to. I just knew, watching him punch holes in the drifts, that this wasn't a walk for him. It was a mission. We'd gone maybe 100 yards when a deep crack rolled down the valley behind us, followed by a heavy thud. He flinched, I turned, and through the whiteout I could see branches thrashing where a tree had dropped across the road we'd just left. Whatever choices I thought I had, none of them involved turning around anymore. The drifts got deeper the closer we got to the trees. That shepherd hit patches where the snow came up to his chest, but he never stopped pulling on the lead. He'd lunge forward, disappear for a second in a wave of white, then pop back up, shake it off, and keep going like the whole mountain depended on him. For a 1-year-old German Shepherd puppy, he moved like a dog who'd done this 100 times. I started seeing little spots of red where his paws punched through the crust. At first, I told myself it was something else. Then I watched him lift a foot and tuck it in for half a step, just long enough to tell me it hurt. That was it for me. I dropped to a knee in the trail, peeled off my gloves, and dug into my pack with numb fingers. He stood there, panting in my face, snow melting on his whiskers while I wrapped torn gauze and a strip of tape around each raw pad. I told him he was allowed to quit. He just leaned his weight into my chest like we didn't have time for that kind of talk. When we started again, the wind shifted and I finally saw it. Through the blur of snow, a shape slowly pulled itself together. A small cabin. Roof hunched under a heavy load, windows almost buried, chimney coughing out the last thin thread of smoke. The dog's whole body changed. Head up, tail straight. He broke into a rough, clipped bark, the kind you don't hear on walks at the park. He charged the door, claws raking at the wood, then spun back to look at me, eyes wide, begging me to hurry. The handle was frozen solid. I threw a shoulder into it once, twice, felt something crack, then the door gave and we stumbled inside together. The air was stale and cold enough to bite. My eyes were still adjusting when I heard it from the dark at the far end of the room, a long, shaky groan, and right after it, the tight, broken whine of that dog as he bolted toward the sound. The first thing I saw was the fire. Not the bright kind, just a thin smear of red coals in the stove, barely alive, giving off more guilt than heat. The rest of the room felt like the inside of a freezer. No lamps, no hum from a fridge. Power had been gone a while. On the floor, right in front of the stove, an older man lay on his side, curled in on himself, hands pulled into his chest. His eyes were open, but not all the way there. He was shaking in that slow, tired way your body does when it's running out of energy to be scared. That shepherd got to him first. He pressed his whole body against the man's back like he'd been holding the line for hours. Then he climbed awkwardly over, laid his head right on the man's chest, and started licking his chin with these small, desperate strokes. A low sound came out of him, almost a growl, almost a cry. I knelt beside them and got my phone out. 1 bar. Half a bar. I hit 911 anyway. Static, a click, then a voice cutting in and out while I shouted an address I'd only seen on a frozen tag. They said words like "we'll try" and "roads are blocked" and "no guarantee on time." So I did what I could with what I had. I fed the stove until the coals woke up and started throwing real light. I dragged blankets off the couch and tucked them around the old man and the dog together like one unit. I found a pot, melted snow on the stove, used the warm water to rub some life back into his hands. The dog never left his side. He only drank when I slid a bowl right under his nose, and even then, his eyes never left the man's face. The call finally dropped for good, and this groan rolled through the cabin as the wind shoved at the walls. The whole place settled a few inches with a loud crack, and in that moment, I knew it was just the 3 of us now, tucked into that little box of wood, while the rest of the mountain disappeared. The worst part wasn't the cold, it was the waiting. Night settled in fast, heavy, and loud. The wind wrapped itself around that little cabin and just howled, like it was trying to peel the walls away one board at a time. The only light we had was the orange shove of the stove and the sharp circle from my headlamp sliding across old wood. That German Shepherd puppy stretched himself out along Arthur's side like a heated blanket with a heartbeat. He had his spine tucked against the old man's back and his paws pressed into his chest, catching every breath. His eyes never completely closed. Every time Arthur twitched, that dog's ears flicked and he lifted his head to check him. When I went to adjust the blanket, I finally saw it. On the collar, under the ice and mud, a small metal plate I hadn't noticed in the truck. I wiped it clean with my thumb. 5 letters, cut deep enough to outlast a few winters. Lodi. I said it out loud without thinking. The dog's ears moved, just a little. Arthur cracked one eye open at the sound, fingers fumbling until they found the thick fur at his ribs. "Good boy, Lodi," he whispered, voice, but proud. "You did it, didn't you?" I leaned in so he wouldn't have to work so hard. He told me in broken little pieces that Lodi was a rescued dog from the shelter in town. Too much energy, too anxious, too loud for most folks. They almost gave up on him. Arthur didn't. He said they played a stupid game. He'd drop to the floor, tap his chest, and say, "Go get help." Lodi would bolt out the door, run to the road or a neighbor's place, then come back when he heard a voice. "Just a backup plan," he said. "Just in case." I looked at that dog, pressed tight against his person in the glow of the fire, and it hit me. The game wasn't a game anymore. He'd decided it was time to use it. Right then, the wind threw itself against the cabin again. Somewhere above us, there was a sharp crack, then a heavy, hollow thud as a tree slammed onto the roof and the whole place shuddered. The walls held, but I knew what it meant. If help was coming, it was going to take a long, long time to get through. The night didn't rush for us. It stretched out, one slow minute after another. I rationed what I had without thinking too hard about it. A couple of granola bars, half a bottle of water, some instant coffee on the stove. It wasn't much. The real heater in that room was on the floor. Lodi's sides were moving fast from the work he'd already done. Every few minutes, his head would drop, eyes half closing, and then some tiny sound from Arthur would snap him back awake. He'd lift his nose to the old man's mouth to feel his breath, then lie down closer, tucking himself tight along his spine. That German Shepherd puppy was doing more for his temperature than any blanket I owned. At one point, I unwrapped a bar and broke it in half. I held out a piece, and he took it as gently as if I'd handed him glass. He chewed once, twice, then left the rest in my palm and went right back to his post against Arthur's chest. I've seen a lot of dogs in rescue work, but the look in his eyes wasn't owner and pet. It was my person, my job. Outside, the world kept icing over. The windows went from cloudy to solid white as the storm glued snow and sleet to the glass. The radio in my truck stayed silent. My phone was a dead brick on the table. Once I swore I heard an engine down the ridge. Hope flared for a second, and then the wind shifted and pulled the sound apart until there was nothing left but the howl. By morning, the roar had faded to a hush. I eased the door open, half expecting to see the driveway. Instead, I stared straight into a wall of packed snow higher than my shoulders, and I knew that even if rescuers were on their way, they weren't getting to this cabin anytime soon. Morning came in gray. No sunrise, just a softer kind of light pushing through the cracks around the door. Arthur was still on the floor by the stove, but his breathing had settled into a slow, steady rhythm. Color had crept back into his face a little. He was hanging in there, but you didn't need a medical degree to see he wasn't walking out of that cabin on his own. I kept thinking about the wall of snow outside. If nobody could even reach the driveway, nobody was reaching him. If we wanted help, we were going to have to meet it halfway. I grabbed my shovel from the truck and looked over at Lodi. He was already on his feet, standing by the door, tail low, eyes fixed on the handle like he knew exactly what came next. I tried to tell him to stay with Arthur. He just gave me one short, stubborn huff and stayed put. So I gave up arguing with the bravest pup I'd ever met. I slipped his collar back on and rewrapped his paws with fresh strips of gauze and tape, little makeshift boots for a working dog who didn't know the word off-duty. When I cracked the door, cold air shoved in, but at least the wind had eased. We started digging. I'd drive the shovel in, throw snow to the side, and Lodi would push ahead of me, using his chest and shoulders to punch a narrow tunnel through the drifts. He wasn't just following my lead. Every few steps he'd look back, check my position, then turn and keep carving that line, like a dog drawing directions on the mountain. It took time, too much time. By the time we broke through to the tree line and stepped onto the narrow forest road, my arms were shaking and Lodi's tongue was dragging. I looked up and down that road, hoping for tracks. There was nothing, no tire marks, no footprints, just an untouched strip of snow in both directions, and the quiet truth that no one else had made it anywhere near us yet. I stood there on that forest road with a shovel and a tired dog at my side, and it hit me how thin our margin was. Arthur had more color, but he was still an old man on a cabin floor with no way out but us. I wanted to keep digging, to push farther, but I couldn't leave him alone for long. If we just sat in that cabin and waited, it could be hours before anyone even thought to look his way. I looked down at Lodi. His chest rose and fell hard, steam puffing from his mouth, but his eyes stayed locked on the direction of the main road. He'd already done more than most people I know. I dropped to a crouch, so we were eye to eye. "Buddy," I told him, "you know the way better than I do." For a second, he just stared back at me, snow stuck to his eyebrows, tail twitching once. Then, that 1-year-old German Shepherd puppy did exactly what he'd done the first time we met. He turned, leaned into his makeshift boots, and took off down the trench we'd carved, nose pointed toward the world beyond the storm. I watched him go until his shape faded into the gray, then forced myself back inside. I fed the fire, swapped Arthur's damp blanket for a dry one, and sat on the floor between them, listening to the quiet ring in my ears. Every creak in the wood made me wonder if I'd made the dumbest call of my life, letting that pup walk back into the snow alone. And then the silence broke. A low engine noise rolled up through the trees, followed by the wash of headlights cutting through the frosted window. At the top of the narrow path we'd made, the first thing I saw wasn't a machine, but the stubborn silhouette of Lodi, ice hanging from his collar, leading the way back. I stepped out onto the path and saw why the engine sounded so close. Behind Lodi, cutting through the trench we dug, were 2 snowmobiles and a rescue sled. The riders were hunched against the cold, goggles iced over, just following the only clear line they had. His. One of the guys killed his engine and flipped up his visor. He pointed at the dog, shaking his head. "We were turning back," he yelled. Then this shepherd exploded out of the ditch and wouldn't let us pass. Kept running ahead, looking over his shoulder like we were late. That brave pup brushed past me without stopping, straight back into the cabin. By the time we got inside, he was already pressed against Arthur again, tail thumping once, like he was checking to see if the backup he'd ordered finally arrived. The medics worked in quick, practiced motions. Oxygen, vitals, blankets. They slid Arthur onto the sled, careful with every joint and wire. Through all of it, Lodi trotted alongside, bumping the sled with his nose whenever they moved too fast for his liking. Right before they took him out the door, Arthur's eyes fluttered open. His hand fumbled in the air until it landed on familiar fur. Lodi eased his head onto that hand and just stayed there, all that wild energy parked in one still moment. You could see the old man's shoulders let go. On the ride out, every conversation circled back to the dog. Dog's the real rescuer here. No way we'd have found that place without him. I stood in the doorway and watched them disappear down the trail, feeling pretty clear about one thing. All I'd really done was listen to the animal in the road. The rest of the work belonged to him. A few weeks later, after the storm warnings were just old news, I found myself driving into Bozeman, heading toward a rehab center, wondering what I'd find out about Arthur and about the too much, too anxious shepherd they said might not fit into anyone's life. The rehab center in Bozeman wasn't fancy, but when I walked down that hallway and saw him, it felt like stepping back into that storm. Lodi was stretched out of the doorway of the therapy room, head on his paws, watching every person who went in or out. He wore a little vest that said, "In training, companion rescue dog." For a dog people once called too much, he looked pretty steady to me. Arthur was inside, working through some slow physio with a tech. He spotted me over her shoulder and gave this tired, crooked smile that said more than any speech. Lodi lifted his head, checked on him, then checked on me, like he was making sure his 2 main cases were still upright. Later, when the room was quieter, Arthur told me what happened after the news story ran. The local dog rescue folks came out, met Lodi, and decided he wasn't just any rescued dog. They saw what I saw on that mountain. So now he splits his time between staying with Arthur and helping out as a sort of mix between a therapy dog and an emergency helper for some of the other seniors. I'll tell you straight, there was no magic in what he did that night. Just a brave pup who'd been given a chance and a job. Arthur worked simple commands with him in short, happy sessions. Come, stay, go to the door, go get help, over and over with treats and praise until it was just part of who he was. Their winter backup plan wasn't complicated either. a little extra food and water stored away, warm blankets, a dog who wasn't afraid of people and who knew the path to the road, that tag on his collar and a microchip in case he ever ended up out there alone. Basic stuff, the kind too many folks skip until it's too late. One of the nonprofit rescue workers caught me in the hallway on my way out. She asked if I'd be willing to help tell Lodi's story wider, to speak up for all the too anxious, too hyper dogs sitting in kennels right now, just waiting for someone to give them a job and a person to love. I still think about how simple his choice was. A 1-year-old rescued shepherd saw a stranger's truck, walked into a blinding storm, stopped me in the middle of the road, and would not move until I followed him. He dragged me up a buried driveway to a frozen cabin, curled his body around his person all night, and then walked back out into the snow again to bring the rescuers straight to our door. Dogs don't sit down and make speeches about loyalty. They just live it. This little guy's journey from abandonment to rehabilitation shows how important nonprofit rescue groups really are. He only got to be that hero on the mountain because somebody once looked past the too anxious, too much label and decided to stick with him instead of giving up. If you share your life with a rescued puppy, you already know it's not magic. It's repetition, patience, and a lot of tiny choices on boring days. A few basic commands like come, stay, go to the door, and go get help can turn a nervous pup into the kind of partner you trust when everything goes wrong. Caring for a rescued puppy is more than love. It's responsibility. It's pet care. If you live where winters hit hard, do yourself and your dog a favor. Keep a small emergency kit ready for both of you. Water, extra food, a simple first aid kit, a flashlight, a reflective collar or harness so your dog is easy to spot in bad weather. Make sure there's an ID tag on that collar and a microchip under the skin. Those little details can be the difference between a dog lost in the storm and a dog leading someone home. The last time I visited, Lodi was stretched out on a bench by the window, head resting on Arthur's leg, both of them soaking up a slice of winter sun like it was the easiest thing in the world. Watching them, it was pretty clear to me that on the night that storm came down, I wasn't the grown-up in the room. The dog was. If you want to say thanks or share what this story stirred up in you, leave a comment for Arthur and Lodi, or for me if you like. Somewhere up in Montana, that too much shepherd is still doing what he does best, keeping his person safe and reminding the rest of us what loyalty really looks like.